top one is?
This one's good. This one is
Is mine
iffy.
on Wi-Fi? It's okay.
Yours is all live.
Okay. Watch and see if it gets interrupted on the signal. Hopefully it connected me back to Wi-Fi. All right, we good? Nope. On John's? Or on mine?
You're good here.
Okay, should we just go?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're here to talk more about the Schaeffer Cox resentencing. We're here with John Lamb, last free man, Roger Roots, anti-government news. I'm Kelli Stewart with Both Sides of the Glass Prison Ministry. We're just going to go through, read our notes, and kind of have a little bit of a laid-back discussion about how the second half of the sentencing went. Today was resentencing for Schaeffer Cox after his charge for solicitation to murder was dismissed with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we are still pending an answer. We will be coming back tomorrow morning to find out what the judge has decided. So we're just going to jump right into our afternoon recap.
Yes, still no sentence. This is a sentencing hearing, still no sentence. And by the way, it's the only federal sentencing hearing that I've ever seen, and I've seen more than my share, that's ever gone 2 days. So tomorrow will be day 2. Day 1, I would say, was almost all positive for Schaeffer Cox. The day started out with a very eminent professor of psychology named Mark Cunningham, and a stellar psychologist. I would say premier, one of the top psychologists in the world. And he was unshakable. He had done a diagnosis of Schaeffer Cox that essentially overruled a previous diagnosis by another psychologist a couple of years ago. And Schaeffer Cox has some issues. He exaggerates, and he's given to a little bit of bombastic speech. But he's not mentally ill. He does not need medication. He's not a threat to himself or others. And if released, he will not be a source of violence. And so that was the point of Dr. Cunningham on the stand. And I'll tell you what, on cross-examination after lunch, I don't know what you guys thought, but I thought Dr. Cunningham resoundingly defeated the prosecutor's attempts to shake him a little bit.
Yeah, he was probably the best witness I've ever seen go before a prosecutor, and that was probably Scrocky, is the prosecutor. He's probably the worst prosecutor I've ever seen in a case. He was uncomfortable, tripping over his words, trying to get the witness to stumble. Didn't work at all. The witness actually made a fool of him. The entire cross-examination went on for less than 45 minutes. And that was after hours this morning with the defense examining him. I thought that the cross-examination would go on for hours. I thought they would just grill that doctor, that psychologist. But it actually went remarkably well. When we came back from lunch, they did invite Department of Homeland Security. That's compliments of supporters that were there today. We were told by a gentleman who was behind me in line. He comes in every week and has for 2 years, and he has never seen Homeland Security in that building. He said, is there a high-profile case going on? What's with this bomb-sniffing dogs? And I said, that's compliments of us. And after all the profiling they did of Schaeffer, I wrote down that having the 10 DHS officers and the dog showed paranoia, conspiracy theories, and possibly schizophrenia from the government. Bomb-sniffing dogs for stay-at-home moms felt a little bit over the top, but that's just something I noted. So they started back when we came back with prosecution, asking the questions. Like we said, everything he asked, it was pretty much rebutted, and the doctor did absolutely great. He said over and over, he painted a really great narrative. So there was some concern originally that if supporters came, it would make it look like Schaeffer Cox was too much of a leader. But what the psychologist said that was so great is he said Schaeffer has not changed his music. His music is the same, but his words have changed. So the words he was using 10 years ago, he's not using now. His overall beliefs and patterns are the same, but his music has not changed. However, the music that he plays is not a threat to anybody whatsoever, and had it not been for the federal informants, the violence wouldn't have been introduced to start with. They did talk about some of the devices that he had. The prosecution was asking questions about the different groups that he was in and the different devices that he had, and it was discussed that these different devices didn't even work. They were all partial. There was nothing that was actually being put into place to be used. against anybody, and then also said, the prosecutor said, did you know Cox was in Liberty Bell, Second Amendment groups, sovereign citizen groups that were all anti-government? And it was really great when the doctor spoke up. I'm sure you guys noticed that, and said, I'm aware he supported Second Amendment groups. Outside of that, I'm not sure the groups did anything outside of meat. That doesn't necessarily mean they're anti-government. That their goal was to have the government uphold the Constitution regarding the Second Amendment. And just because you're kind of holding the government accountable doesn't make you anti-government. That might even make you pro-government. Otherwise, you would talk about abolishing your government altogether. But Schaeffer was moving for accountability within government. He was trying to work in the legislative, writing laws to protect the Second Amendment. Clearly, that's not an anti-government individual.
One thing I noticed about some of this was the concentration on what some of the informants said and how they set Schaeffer up. Mm-hmm. It looks like to me there was weeks of this. One witness mentioned that there was over 100 hours of recordings that the informants took, and this is inflammatory stuff that the informants, like not Will Coleman in this one, but I can't even think of his name right at the moment. He was in the courtroom the day that informant was.
Bill
Fulton. Bill Fulton was one of these main informants that was there, has been there all day long today, sitting on the prosecution side. And he said some very inflammatory things, trying to putting words in Schaeffer's mouth all along while he's recording it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. One of the major ones is, the fact is they were trying to set him up on a conspiracy charge. So Mr. Fulton, the informant, had asked Schaeffer Cox, what's your plan? What's your plan? You need a plan. And even alluded to the fact that Schaeffer could have his throat slit unless he had a plan. So here's the federal government basically forcing Schaeffer Cox to come up with a plan so that they could convict him.
Mm-hmm. And this guy's being paid by the federal government. Not only just is he volunteering, he's being paid.
Mm-hmm. And the defense painted a really clear picture that the conspiracy apparently was, in the end, it was between the defendants and the federal informant. It wasn't even the defendants on their own. So if the violence was being pushed from an informant, you didn't have two people making plans. You had Schaeffer and his guys making plans, prepping and whatnot. But the actual violent talk was between the defendant and the informant. So
to some extent. Now there were two co-defendants, one of whom I believe has been released from prison, and the other is Lonnie Vernon, who apparently is still in prison. And so there were some co-defendants, and one line of questioning where this prosecutor, in my opinion, totally failed to prove his point. He was getting this psychologist to answer questions about, well, did you know that Schaeffer Cox started this organization? Did you know he started that organization? Did you know he was the head of this organization? And yet you say he's shy? And the Dr. Cunningham blew the guy away, the prosecutor, and he says, I've never once said he was shy. That's not at all my testimony.
Right.
Literally, that was the entire line of cross-examination, and it went flat for the government.
Another great statement was the prosecutor asked the doctor, are you aware that even up to October of 2019, Schaeffer Cox has been receiving letters, or the judge has been receiving letters on behalf of Schaeffer, alluding that Cox has been done wrong. Are you aware of that? And the doctor doesn't miss a beat. He says this whole sentencing is under the presumption that Cox has been done wrong. It's resentencing. He had a charge, the biggest charge, overturned with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That means something was done wrong in the trial. And so they were here to talk about the fact that something has been done wrong. Does that mean the court is a conspiracy theorist because they believe that something was done wrong to Schaeffer? He tried to point out, well, but on the Schaeffer Cox site, he doesn't own responsibility for his illegal guns. And he responds, 310 months sentence, the 310-month sentence in a CMU was due to the conspiracy to murder, not due to having illegal weapons. So his whole site is built on the fact that he's been targeted because he didn't commit a conspiracy. He doesn't address these partial weapons he had because that's not why he's in a CMU. He's in a CMU because of the conspiracy and the solicitation to murder, and those were just flat out false. He's never said he didn't have some small pieces and parts of weapons that the government says is outside of the Second Amendment.
And we get back to some of those partial weapons or parts. Some of them weren't even weapons. They were just parts of things. The informants, they are the ones that gave them gave up. A lot of these weapons came from the government themselves. They supplied Schaeffer Cox with these parts, these unworkable weapons, or what they want to call it, illegal.
Grenade shells, which weren't even, usable as grenades, but Schaeffer Cox was convicted of possession of grenades.
They tried to paint him as the sovereign citizen and how awful it was that he met in Denny's with his friends to a DeJean court where they were to nullify different court findings regarding domestic violence and also the weapons charges. Prosecution was really upset about this coffee meeting at Denny's. And I loved how every time he tried to push, he's circumventing the courts and he's meeting, and he responded, yes, they met, but I'm not sure their nullifying of the charges accomplished anything more than the coffee they drank. Continues to go back to the First Amendment. These people met. You could sit around all day and say, I do not have the speeding ticket that I just got right now. Will you find me not guilty of that? Did we just commit a crime? Did we just, mock or flip our nose up to the courts? And if we did, is that illegal? So to sit and go over this meeting at Denny's and how they didn't believe in the validity of the courts. It was literally a bunch of guys getting together at, having coffee and making up their own little court that accomplished nothing in the end. They never tried to use force to get the courts to override the decision. They never said, we did this, now we're gonna hurt somebody if the courts, doesn't take this off the docket. They completely, were just operating in their own circle. So.
They moved to another witness, Mr. Michael Anderson. Now I understand he was a co-defendant, but he also may have been testifying on behalf of the prosecution. That's my understanding.
Yes,
anyway,
he was a witness for the prosecution.
He had been a
in
witness for
first
the
trial.
prosecution. But his testimony was favorable to Schaeffer Cox today. He basically said, actually, one of the few cases where I think paragraphs from the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn was actually read into a federal court proceeding where there was this discussion of the fall of Russia into the Soviet communism, and Solzhenitsyn had paragraphs in the book about if only we had fought some of those government blue ISIS cops as they were getting more and more powerful, and Schaeffer Cox and and Mr. Anderson both had referenced the fall of Russia extensively in their militia activities back in 2009, 2010, and it was rather interesting.
Just wrapping up real quick with the doctor. Strachey, is it Strachey? Is that how you pronounce his name? I think I might be getting that wrong.
Maybe Strachey or something.
Strachey.
Yeah.
He asked the doctor, he was very upset or focused, tried to be, on the fact that Schaeffer Cox wasn't just doing things in his own group having coffee, but he was actually trying to move into legislation and change things, which again is so ironic that would be a negative when that clearly shows he supports government. He just wants it to be on track. But he brought up the fact that Schaeffer came in on a three-way tie, getting almost 35% of the vote running for office, and just what a big deal that was. And then I was gonna say the other thing, he was trying to make it sound like the doctor would say anything to potentially help Schaeffer, and the prosecutor said, "You would believe anything Schaeffer Cox told you. Is that correct?" And the doctor leans forward and says, "No, sir, he is a most unreliable source."
Yeah, the doctor did not.
He was not biased
At
at
several
all.
times, he did not help Schaeffer at all. He called him childlike in some of his fantasies about building a submarine, a militia submarine.
Being taken in by Russia
he
as
referred
a
to Schaeffer Cox
refugee.
as childlike in some of his ideas.
But the interesting thing that I thought in this whole case is they tried to paint him in the original charges as being the one seeking violence. And throughout this, it really paints this picture that Schaeffer actually wanted to protect his family. And so because of his ego, he wouldn't have been the one to go out and seek violence. And so the very idea that he was trying to, conspire to murder federal officials went against the very nature of who his ego is. His ego is puffed up on, I'm the hero, I'm going to save the day, I'm the good guy, and I'm going to protect my family and my neighbors, and call me with the Liberty Bell, I'm going to show up and help you. And so this idea that he would want to hurt somebody is actually completely counterproductive to to his belief of what a great person he is, and the only way violence would have been used if somebody was being harmed, and even at that it was proven false, because when they were essentially coming after him, he was trying to flee to Canada.
He was
so
pretty much
once
been
again, there's no violence there.
He was considered a prepper. What if something
Yep.
happened? What if the government failed? And so it was all these big things that could happen that probably would never happen, is what they would even say. So Schaeffer was technically has been put in jail for something that the government believes is never going to happen. They don't believe the government's going to fall.
Yep.
Schaeffer believed if the government fell, this is what we're preparing for. He was put in prison for that.
And they state that in Fairbanks, where he was, there's one road coming in and out. If trucks fail and can't get in, that you could go 3 days and you're out of food. So prepping and being prepared and thinking through things was a pretty big deal for people in his community. It's not being tried. It wasn't tried up in his community because they all stipulated on both sides that this would be held in Washington, for those of you wondering why it wasn't up there in Fairbanks. But Washington is very different than Fairbanks, and so prepping and doing a lot of the things he was doing was not out of the ordinary at all for him. Let's see, they did go into, the judge asked this question, which I noticed, and it's definitely not a help to Schaeffer for being released, but he focused in on his marriage, and he said, you referred to the marriage as estranged. Is it intact? What is it? I know when they're talking about release, people are more likely to be released if they're going back to a family or some form of a stable situation. And so when the judge paused and asked the doctor that, I figured that was probably on his mind. Are we sending him to a home? Is he going to be alone and go back to these behaviors?
But the government hasn't helped with this. If you noticed, he could have been kept with his family close to it in a prison close by, except they've separated him for the last 8 years.
Yeah.
Totally across the country in Indiana, in a CMU prison where it's hard to get in there.
Well, and surrounded his wife at gunpoint,
Yeah.
and then turn and go, now is everything going okay at home? I mean, I know we pointed guns at your wife and children,
Threatened to
but
take their kids away.
right, but I hope everything's okay still, because if it's not, we might, But anyway, the answer was they're legally married. They're not continuing in a relationship at this time. She's disillusioned and moving on at this point with her life. So I assume that's going to come. It's going to hold a little bit of weight on, whether or not he'll be released. But that's.
Now, the final witness for the Schaeffer Cox defense team was Charles Formosa, who was an investigator for the lawyers. And Formosa did an analysis of the discovery that exists in the case, and he was trying to track down a couple things. Number one, this idea of the 2-for-1, which has become so famous about the Schaeffer Cox case. It's been alleged by the government that Schaeffer Cox had this plan to murder 2 government agents for every 1 patriot that was murdered. And of course, this Charles Formosa did an analysis of the discovery. Turns out that the entire thing appeared in the discovery dated February 12, 2011, the first time that idea, the 2-for-1 concept, appears. And then the last time it appears is February 19th. So it's it was really almost not even in the discussion of Schaeffer's world of discourse. Nonetheless, it has risen to be this huge thing in the case, and in fact, he's been convicted of conspiracy to murder federal officials, mostly on the basis of that, and perhaps on the basis of another episode that involved him going to a radio station with a couple of security people who had been under the understanding that they were being watched and attacked, perhaps subject to a imminent attack by a 6-man federal assassination team. And there had been an agreement that if that happens, they would,
do a 2-for-1 or something. It was
something
thrown
like
out.
that.
But that was also came up with after the informants kept pushing Schaeffer. What is your plan? So he throws out, over a couple day period. I don't know, 2-for-1. If they come for any of us, and this team comes, then we'll do this 2-for-1 deal. But I loved how his defense, who I think is just nailing it, pointed out the fictitious federal hit team does not give jurisdiction to the requirements of a federal employee. So it's in order for this conspiracy charge and the points to all be what they are, had to be a federal employee. Well, the team that he believed was after him, they say, is a fictitious team. Therefore, he wasn't conspiring to kill a federal employee. They don't meet the requirements. That was ruled by the Ninth Circuit in the solicitation charge they threw out. His defense says this also needs to apply to the conspiracy charge. The federal hit team didn't exist. Therefore, the statements he made about them, they were fictitious people. He wasn't making a statement. Who he thought was going to come for him didn't even exist.
By the way, one little minor point that was also brought out through this investigator, Charles Formosa, is that Lonnie Vernon, the co-defendant, who's also still in prison, it came up in the discovery that he hadn't paid taxes in 30 years. And of course, the point of making that is that Schaeffer was not a leader of Mr. Vernon, Lonnie Vernon. Rather, Schaeffer was a co-equal participant. And for the purposes of the sentencing guidelines, if you are declared to be a leader of the conspiracy, you get an enhancement. And the defense is trying to make an argument that he should not get that enhancement. He should be a much, much lower sentencing guideline range.
We've had confusion on what this resentencing is. People have said he had a charge drop, so they're going to drop time. That's actually not what they're doing. Because that charge was dropped, this is a completely new sentence. So today there was actually sentencing guideline arguments, and they're relooking at the conspiracy charge, the gun charges, and coming up with an entire, basically new time for him to serve. But they're not saying he took this solicitation charge off, so therefore will take off 4 years. They're actually relooking at the entire case again as a whole.
Yep.
So that could work in his favor. He served 8 years with good time. I think he's getting 10 years credit. That's a long time. He's been in a CMU because of the conspiracy. That's been proven to not
What's
even...
a CMU?
A communication management unit. It's for terrorists. The doctor specifically said today, quote, Schaeffer Cox is not a terrorist, he is a prepper. He is not a terrorist, goes out and seeks harm. Schaeffer is way too grand in his head to ever go out and seek harm on anybody, and to have him in a CMU has been absolute torture. The informants, Bill Fulton, who was there today looking so pretty, because Bill, you're just the prettiest little thing with your blonde hair and clean cut look, very different from when you were entrapping Schaeffer and had the guns and the, all the camo, and you were so hardcore. At any rate, Bill Fulton should be in jail. He was telling somebody to come up with a plan to kill people, and he's walking free, received, I think, $160,000 of taxpayer money, and Schaeffer Cox has been sitting in a communication management unit and would never harm a soul. So
I don't know if he should be in jail, but here's one point that has to be made, is that...
Well, I would switch them spots in a heartbeat if I could. Maybe that's
All right.
unchristian of me, but I would.
One point that has to be made. The judge, after the final defense witness took the stand, asked the prosecutors, do you have any witnesses? They had those 2 or 3 informants in the audience waiting, and they chose not to put them on the stand, including Fulton and the other guy, maybe
Olson.
more.
There's 3
I
at
think
least
it was
in there.
Olson. We're not quite sure, but
Anyway, obviously the prosecutors were very afraid of having those witnesses cross-examined.
yeah, they got their tail handed to them today.
The whole
Regardless
thing,
of what happens,
this
they
whole thing
lost.
though is pretty ironic that the government is accusing Schaeffer of something that he might do or could do in the future, and Schaeffer set in jail for what he feared. He
What he
feared
feared,
that he
yeah.
feared that the government was going to lock him up sometime and come after his family. And what
A
did they
hit
do?
team's gonna come after my family, and literally they literally had his wife on the ground and children, a baby, and I think his daughter was 2 to 4 years old.
They're failing to mention all this
For
in court.
hours with guns, ARs pointed at them, and yet Schaeffer is the one who's got some misplaced fears.
Yeah, and the government is the one who has this conspiracy that people are coming after them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And here they're locking him up for afraid that they're going to come after Schaeffer.
Yep.
He's in jail for what he was fearing.
Yeah. At the end of the day, your free speech, his free speech is what got him put where he is. He said some things he shouldn't have. He got a little cocky, but nothing that you belong in jail over. He didn't do anything wrong, and there he sits to this day. But he looked like he was in good spirits.
He did.
He looked positive. His parents were there from Alaska. I think that's the only Alaska people.
There was other Alaska people. Yeah, there's some.
Was there one other couple?
There
Okay.
were other. There was another guy who was a friend of Schaeffer's who was there, ready to be a witness, by the way, but he
That's
was
right.
not
And
called.
thanks for everyone who came. There's people came on a spur of the moment. Even other people from Montana today.
Yep.
There's people from all over Washington and
They
parts
opened
of
up the
Oregon.
balcony if anybody else wants to come. The judge is very engaged in this. You know, everybody's being polite and listening, and I think that it kind of helps sometimes when there's a good audience there listening. I think the judge maybe takes it a little more seriously and doesn't just.
They
kind
gave us a lot of
keep it.
leadway today. They opened up the balcony for us,
They were
extra
very nice.
overflow. Let us keep our cell phones.
Yep, they were. I mean, they were nice tyrants today, to be honest. It was a fairly orderly kangaroo court.
The sleeping arrangements were not very good for me, but it was okay.
But now, by the way, importantly, tomorrow morning, the very first thing that's going to happen is the judge is going to give a ruling with regard to exactly the precise sentencing guideline range that he has decided to put Schaeffer Cox in. What happened, there was an argument at the end of the day where the lawyers were arguing with each other about the guideline range. There's really an adjustment for the leadership question, whether or not Schaeffer Cox was a leader and gets a 2-point upward enhancement or adjustment. And then the other question is whether there's a serious enhancement for a victim being a federal officer. Now here, keep in mind, the lawyers pointed this out. He's been convicted, and it's been upheld by the Ninth Circuit, of conspiring to murder federal officials. All right, but in the sentencing guideline range, which is a separate manual from the U.S. Code, they give you an enhancement if your victim is a federal official. Okay, so that's a huge enhancement. I think it's a 6-point enhancement or something like that. And so it's double punishment when you think about it. You've already been convicted of conspiring to murder federal officials, and then for sentencing purposes, they try to add an enhancement for your victims being federal officials. So that is a real big point of contention among the lawyers. The judge almost seemed like he was ready to rule on it, but he wanted to take it under advisement tonight and rule on it first thing tomorrow morning before the rest of the sentencing hearing gets underway.
I feel like this judge is listening. He's being attentive. I mean, the whole court is a kangaroo court, or we wouldn't be here. Schaeffer wouldn't have spent the last decade in prison. But I really feel like this judge is taking this seriously, and I mean, he even helped the defense a few times with some of his statements that just showed he was, you know, really listening and engaging. And so please be praying, you guys, that he gets time served, and that they come up with a sentence that he's already served, and he gets sent home to his family. He needs out of that prison, and he definitely cannot go back to that CMU. If the judge has heard everything he's heard and sends him back to the CMU, we've got bigger problems than we thought. So they blew the lid off of all the things that the headline said. The directory of officials who might lead martial law was proven to be false. The 2-for-1 was proven to be nothing like what they said. That was the headlines. Militia leader gets incarcerated for doing a 2-for-1 to kill federal officials. That wasn't what it was. Hit list by Anderson. Anderson alone wrote a list, and it was people he was looking into. Had nothing to do with
And again,
Schaeffer. It was
everything
one
was
page.
contingent. Schaeffer and Lonnie Vernon, their entire idea was, hey, when there's this collapse of society, when government takes over and comes in with martial law, at that point everything's off, and we're just going to have to get violent. So it was a contingent.
If they're coming. From
Yeah,
us.
completely contingent.
What if
on-
they took your kids? What if you took your kids or hurt your
Exactly.
family? What are you going to
Yeah.
do if they hurt your family?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
This was not a conspiracy to murder in any sense. It was so contingent on events that even the government claims are not likely to happen. Now, I actually think it's likely that we're going to have martial law in the next,
So this was one other good
5
thing.
years.
There was a lot of powerful things said, but the defense attorney made the statement to say, it is not conspiracy to murder. If you say, if somebody breaks into my house today and shoots my child, will you kill them to save us? That's essentially what Schaeffer did under the pressure of that informant. That's essentially what he said. Okay, if they take my kid then. And the defense attorney laid out and said, that is not I don't know which court it is that's upheld that, but that is not conspiracy to murder. If you say,
they mentioned the First
if
Circuit
somebody
case.
comes in and rapes my child or something, so that's a good thing to keep in mind with this case.
9:30 tomorrow. Back at the
9:30.
courthouse.
Yep, we'll be there.
Thank you guys, and thank everyone who's following this, and thank everyone who showed up today.
See you tomorrow.